Hello and welcome to another Mia's Den guide on the Patreon. Today we're playing with piece of paper. I'm gonna be trying to explain the difference between all the brands of paints that I have used, at least. I'm not gonna be judging brands don't have an experience with, and trying to explain to you guys what makes them strong and what makes them weak. Because keep in mind, no brand is a jack of all trades, and even those brands who do most things really well still don't do anything perfectly. So it's important to be able to understand paints and what makes them good, because sometimes it might take you 4 hours to base coat a skin tone and you might start hating painting skin tones, while the truth is there's nothing wrong with painting skin tones. Maybe the paint you used weren't just good for that. So it's important to understand these kind of things, and I think that this video can be a good introduction to also explain my thought process for any future and past guide when I paint something, why I pick certain colors and certain brands in that specific detail over others. So let's get started with the most known paint brand, which is GW. I'm gonna be showing you guys how Incubi Darkness performs on this piece of paper, and we're gonna be talking a little bit more about this brand of colors. So as I place the color on the palette, let me see, okay, as I place the color on the piece of paper, you can see that, you can already see that it's fairly thick. The paint is leaving streaks, which means that GW paints kind of require to be thinned a little bit before you can work with them. And if you do thin them a little bit, they're easily workable. Let me do this again, just very quickly. I'm working on a piece of paper, so the paint is drying very quickly, but I hope I can show you. As you can see, if you thin the paint a little bit more, it doesn't leave as many streaks, and it's a good base coat color. These paints don't really have too many weaknesses. Like, as you can see, you can layer with them fairly nicely, and you can also glaze with them really nicely too. That's one of the perks of GW base colors. You can do. This is the jack of all trades, if you want to look for one in mini painting. There's a caveat though. They don't do anything perfectly, which means that base coating isn't exactly great based on the colors, and layering is pretty decent, and glazing is hit or miss based on the paint itself. As you probably know, not all paints are created equally. Some paints come from natural, organic pigments, while others come from chemical pigments. So you're gonna have this kind of difference happening across all brand of paints. Some colors are gonna be better at glazing than others. Usually organic colors, which means blues, for example, they use organic pigments. Blues are gonna be easier to blend and glaze than, I don't know, a red, for example, because it's not organic. And that's like a staple across all paints. But when it comes to GW, there is one thing that I really want to talk about, and it is that their white is possibly the worst white in mini painting. What does that mean? That it doesn't just mean that the white paint, white scar or whatever, it's bad, because it is bad. It also means that any color that has any white in it is also bad. So all the paints I am willing to suggest from GW when it comes as the range of paints are their base range of paints. Base. Any layer or Agilite or Alite paint usually has some element of white in it, which is the white scar white, and that makes the paints pretty much unusable to me. They start chalking up super easily, they're very difficult to control, they're very difficult to thin, they're just not fun to work with. So if you like GW paints, and you rightfully should like them because the base range is really good, as I showed here, you should probably consider investing in brighter colors from other ranges, or look into mixing and have just, I don't know, a white, a yellow from other brands, and use those colors to highlight the base range from GW. That's gonna work out pretty nicely too. That's what I do too. Whenever I'm using GW, I tend to use it as a base, and then I highlight it using Vallejo or Reaper or Chimera or something else. And that's it for GW, really. Their contrast paints, I will talk about them a bit more later on when I discuss the inks, because they're literally the same thing. But as for paints, like the one that come in the pot, that's all I have to say. They are pretty decent across the board. They can do good base coating, they can do good layering and glazing. They wet blend not too greatly, but it's still doable if you know what you're doing. The problem is that any paint that isn't a base paint is bad quality because of the white they use. And that's it. Now let's move to Vallejo. Vallejo has two ranges of paints. It has game color and model color. Let's start with game color. There you go. We have a Scurvy Green. This color is used a lot across many different paint jobs. And the reason is because it's beautiful. It is a very, very cool, nice color. As you can see from the get-go, the paint is super thin. You don't really need to thin these paints when you're base coating with them, because it's very easy to figure out if a paint is ready to base coat if you move it around a palette. If it leaves streaks, then it needs to be thinned. If it doesn't, then it's good. This paint here doesn't leave any streaks, so you can easily base coat with it if you know how to extend paint on a model. See? And like, the less paint you have on the brush, the more layery it becomes. So that's pretty cool. That's a very good thing about these game color paints. The amount of paint you have on the brush really defines what kind of finish you're gonna have. It's not related to thinning per se, it's related to quantity more. So the paint is already very thin on its own. If you apply it kind of thickly, it's gonna become a base coat. If you apply it with almost no paint on the brush, it's gonna slowly become a layer. So also think about this when you paint. It's not just about dilution like many people say, it's also about quantity on the brush. And in the case of Vallejo game color, this means a lot. If you have little paint on the brush, you're gonna get a layer or even a glaze. If you have a lot, you're gonna get a base coat. What is the problem with game color though? The problem with game color is that the paints are inconsistent as heck, which means that the difference between one paint and another from the same range is massive. Some paints are really nice to use, like Scrofulous Brown, for example. Others are awful, like, I don't know, the blue they have. I can't really explain why. It doesn't matter how much you shake them. It's just kind of random. Some paints are really good, others are really terrible. They just don't cover, they leave streaks, they're chalky, they're just awful paints. So the consistency in the game color range is very, very, very abysmal, which means that I never suggest buying the full range and just, you know, just making the crazy expense of buying all of the paints from the game color range, because only a few of them are actually worth buying. Many others aren't. I personally never use game color except when I do non-metallic gold, because I really do like this color. It's a nice brownish color, and it has one of the strengths that game color has, which is vibrancy. Game color paints are incredibly vibrant and saturated in an environment of mini painting. Mini painting paints, except Chimera, are usually desaturated because a lot of mixing has happened when making the paint, which makes them kind of more on the gray side than the full saturated side. As you can see, this color here is incredibly saturated. It's almost looking black on the palette, on the camera, but it's as you thin it and you move it around, you can see it's more like a teal green. And that's because this color is incredibly saturated, like most of the colors from the game color range. So if you're looking for very strong saturation, for whatever reason, an OSL or a very cartoony non-metallic or stuff like that, game color is fine, but I would never use it as a single brand, and I would never use it as a single layer either, in a sense that I would be using maybe model color, mix some of the game color into the model color base coat and use that to give vibrancy to the model color so that I can get a nice smooth base coat with a lot of vibrancy thanks to the game color. But I don't believe these paints are good when used as a single brand. I really believe these paints are good only when you use them to thin, pretty much, because they are very thin. When you use them to thin as well as mix into other ranges of paints, whatever they are, it doesn't matter, as long as you're using them to bring vibrancy to another range. For example, Incubi Darkness, you can add some of this green from game color to the Incubi Darkness we tried earlier, and you can make this Incubi Darkness slightly brighter and also much more vibrant, taking it, you know, more towards that kind of route. So keep that in mind as well. Whenever you're working with paints, it's important to understand mixing. It's not important to mix every color from the get-go. You can have triads, you can have, you know, recipes, it's fine. it is important though to understand what happens when you mix two colors. And hopefully this guide can shed some light on the topic. You don't always mix to create a color. Sometimes you mix also to enhance a color, like you would in this case. You would add some of this game color to the Incubi Darkness to make the Incubi Darkness more vibrant, more green, more strong, right? Because Incubi Darkness is kind of blackish, you know what I mean? So keep those things in mind because they matter a lot when you're painting minis. Moving on, Vallejo Model Color. It's a range that I love. It's one of my favorite ranges. Those of you who watch the stream, most of you guys watch the stream, know that I love Chimera, I love Model Color, and I love Reaper. And Model Color is pretty much my workhorse. I use it a lot. And the reason why I use Model Color a lot is because the paints are consistent as heck. Pretty much all of the paints across the range behave the same way. They have kind of the same coverage, they have kind of the same way to be diluted. They are very, very, very equal across each other. Doesn't matter what color you're using, they're gonna be pretty much behaving the same way. As for Model Color, is way thicker than Game Color. It needs a little bit of thinning, not as much as GW does, but they do require a little bit of thinning. And as you thin them, the paints will do a crazy nice job at layering. They are probably the best layer paint on the market, I would say. As you can see, even on this piece of paper, they're doing really well. Keep in mind that these paints are a bit granulated, like they have a bit of body to the paint, and I don't know if you can see, but like the paint is leaving small granules behind as I layer. So you're never gonna get a full super smooth layer because of that, because the paints are full of granules. But if you thin the paint enough and you work with glazes, then you will get a very nice smooth coat like this. So I really suggest Model Color. I maybe don't suggest buying the whole range because I don't think it's never necessary, but I think they are really good paints. I highly suggest them if you have never tried them out. One of the weaknesses of Game Color is that they lack vibrancy, which is why Model Color lack vibrancy, which is why Game Color exists, I would say. You can bring vibrancy to Model Color, adding Game Color to it. You see that this green is still incredibly powerful. This purple is more of a gray purple. The camera isn't really picking up the colors perfectly, unfortunately. Let me try to increase the exposure a bit, so maybe you can see more. As you can see, as I increase the exposure, you can see that this color is more of a gray or a purple, not a pure purple. And you will notice the difference when I start showing inks and game and Chimera colors. But yes, Vallejo Model Color are kind of desaturated, more of a realistic color. Real life is never fully saturated unless you're looking at neon or signs, but like a real life is not too saturated. So they are more realistic colors, while Game Color are more fantasy colors. But you can mix and match the two colors together to create some really good effects. Again, I don't suggest going all in on the Game Color range because it is expensive and it's not too worth it. But there are a few colors from the range that are really good. The primary and secondary color, or this green as well, this is good. You could buy these to enhance the power of any other paint. I still don't suggest it though, because I think inks are better for that purpose, and we'll talk about that later. I don't think buying Game Color to push the vibrancy is a good choice, because inks are better for that. So this is Game Color. Let's move on to Reaper. I'm gonna be showing you the HD set. It has been discontinued, but don't worry, the paints from the HD set pretty much were incorporated in the Bone set. So imagine I am just reviewing a Bone paint, okay? Because that's literally what it is. Reaper paints are very, very, very medium rich, which means that every drop of paint, all the paints we reviewed so far are kind of charged with pigments. Reaper are a bit more medium, as you can see, like as I move the paint around, it's not really separating, but it is very strongly medium focused, which means that these paints really shine when you wet blend and when you glaze. Base coating with them is a bit of a chore, especially if you're doing it on black, But as you can see, like the glazing and layering is beautiful with these paints. So I highly suggest them. If you're somebody who really likes glazing and you like matte paints, take a look at them. That's why I use them. I mostly use them for doing like some final glazing or for the finish, really. As for finish wise, well, GW is a bit on the satin side, not too satin, but it's satin finish. Game color is incredibly glossy, which is also one of the bad things about it. They look fake as heck. They are very glossy paints, and that's a bit of an issue most of the time. Nothing is really that glossy, so these paints definitely need a medium or to be added to a more matte paint to actually work. If you use them just straight up, the model is gonna look like it's wet. Model color is on the matte side, not ultra matte like Scale, but it's matter than GW. And the Reaper is incredibly matte, pretty much like Scale. Very matte paint. So like they almost reflect no light. You see the color and that's it. Moving on, we have well, Scale 75. We have these paints too. So Scale 75 has amazing metallics. I'm not even gonna try to explain why they are amazing. They just are. If you're looking to true metallic paints, the best in my opinion are the Scale 75 paints. They're just great. They cover fantastically. They blend really well between each other. You can sort of even glaze with them, which is incredible for a metallic. They look real. They're beautiful paints. So yes, if you like metallic paints, get the Scale set, the Scale metallic paints. When it comes to normal paints, so on a white background like this one, this paint looks pretty neat, and that's pretty nice. The problem is that when you actually apply Scale paints on a model, the coverage is worse than Reaper's. These paints are really good when you glaze. They're probably, I don't want to say they are the best glazing paints, but they are really freaking good at glazing. You can do some really thin glazes and give some hint of color, and they will allow you to achieve that. That's where they really shine. Great paints for that. The colors they have a lot of vibrancy. Like look, this light blue is incredibly strong vibrancy wise, so that's nice. The problem is the abysmal coverage. They can barely wet blend, and layer it's almost impossible. You can only really glaze with them. That's how I found them to be. You can definitely base coat, you can definitely do all of these things, but it's way more difficult than other brands. So if you want to do those things, maybe don't use Scale, and if you like Scale, maybe use them to bring the vibrancy, because you can use the vibrancy these paints let you have through the glazing moment, but you can have a more desaturated gray looking model and then bring the colors in with the glazes. I do this all the time when I paint. It's a very easy way to paint, allows you to understand the values and then bring the color into the equation rather than have to do both at the same time, because it is easier. So you can use the Scale paints for that. You can glaze the color in after you worked with other brands like Vallejo or something, and then you can bring the color in. If you want to use them as a go-to brand, I have tried liking them for the longest time. I just can't. As for Scale, they also have an artist range of paints. This is interesting. These paints are hit or miss in a sense that they are not really consistent, much like game color. The consistency between different paints is meh. They are incredibly thick. As you can see, this one is leaving like a little bit of a poop effect on the model, and the reason why they are so thick is because they are pretty much an entry level heavy body paint. As you can see, like one thing you probably might have noticed, but if you haven't, I'll talk about it. As I was thinning the different paints I showed so far, they lost their vibrancy a lot as I thinned them. The colors have a lot of power to them when they are super thick. The moment you thin them even ever so slightly, they lose that power a lot and they become more gray, or they reflect more the color of the object beneath it. They lose a lot of their saturation, a lot of their vibrancy. These paints don't, because these are pretty much heavy bodies, which means that doesn't matter how much you thin them, even glaze consistency, even a glaze from these paints will have a lot of its power. and that's where they really shine. Again, scale is really good at glazing. These paints are incredible at glazing, the best paints for glazing. I'm going to be using them a lot more in the future because I've been trying to think ways of using them, and I think I will finally use them. The problem is that when you use the paint at its thickness level, it's really difficult to base coat with it. It leaves a lot of streaks around the model. It's incredibly difficult to get coverage, and if you thin it even a little bit to get rid of the streaking, the paint just completely lose coverage, which means you never want to base coat with these paints, ever. You always want to use them added into other colors. You want to use them as glazes, but you do not want to base coat with this. You're going to be miserable base coating with these paints. These are probably the worst paints for base coating, but they are really good at glazing, and the colors they have are amazing, very vibrant, very beautiful. Keep in mind that some of the colors, as I said, are hit or miss, which means that some colors retain vibrancy more than others. There are a few colors from the range that really look gray once they dry. Like, they look very vibrant when you get them out of the pot. Once they dry, they look gray, so it needs experimentation. The full set isn't too expensive for a set of paint. It's like 200 euros, I think. Although I don't really think you need the full set, because some of the paints are very repetitive. Like, there's like not really copies, but there's like colors that are very similar, and if you have a basic knowledge of mixing, you won't need to buy both of them. You can just buy one and then modify it to look like the other. So I don't think you have to buy the full set. Again, if you're unsure, just buy the primaries and secondaries and then mix from there. It's way less expensive, and it allows you to push your quality even more because you finally understand paints doing that. Pro Acryl is next. We got Pro Acryl. So these paints are probably the thinnest paints across the one we showed so far. They are very, very thin. Don't get fooled though, they are super high coverage. They have an insane coverage. These paints are fantastic for base coating. Some of the colors have a lot of vibrancy to them, although when they dry, they tend to lose that vibrancy a lot, especially on a black background. So if you want to paint vibrancy, do not use black when using Pro Acryl. Use a gray primer or do a zenithal, because it's never gonna, like on a black primer, it's gonna be not too great. The finish of these paints, as well as the scale paints, is incredibly matte too, so they all dry very matte. Some of the colors from the range are really good, like the blues. I love the blues from Pro Acryl. I need to use them more actually. Now that I'm using this color, I feel like I'm missing out by not using it as much as I should, because it is a beautiful color. The glazing is really nice. As you can see, like the paint becomes a layer and a glaze really nicely. They don't like when you do long brush strokes. So in this specific case, if you want like a smooth coverage, do short brush strokes and try to connect them to each other without overlapping too much, rather than do a long stroke. For long strokes, you want to use inks, pretty much. If you're glazing and you're doing long strokes, like kind of a wash kind of glaze, use inks. Any paint I've showed so far, any paint really, will not do well when used it to do long brush strokes, because as you do a long brush stroke, you increase the chance of leaving little droplets of granular paint, and that's gonna kind of diffuse the effect of a smooth blend. If you want to do that on a, like for example, if you have a big cape and you want to do a long blend or a long change of tone, use inks. Do not use paints, because those don't work too well. But on a small scale, on a very small scale, these paints do really well. I like them. I feel like some paints from the range are too desaturated. The reds are terrible in my opinion. Just straight up terrible. Like, you might as well use GW. GW reds are very good actually. But like the reds from Pro Acryl are not good at all. The yellows are not good at all. The skin tone colors are not good at all. The blues are very nicely and very nice. And just experiment with colors you like. The blue is the most saturated color they have across the board. All the others are way less saturated than this blue here. But if you like ultra matte paints, you like paints that cover very easily in like one brush stroke, and don't create too much of a messy looking model, because you don't get any streaks in your base coating. As you can see, I have not diluted these paints, just out of the pot you can paint with them. These paints are great. They are great. They truly are for that. If you want to use them for, you know, more of a vibrant paint job, except the blues, they don't do too well. The wet blending is good, but not great. They separate a whole lot on the wet palette. So if you place a drop of Pro Acrylic on your wet palette and you wait like 20 minutes, you're gonna end up with medium on one side and paint on the other, which is annoying as heck. So you keep that in mind. These paints, you could literally use them in a well. You don't need a wet palette for these paints. You can use a well kind of thing and just drop the paint in the well. If the weather in your area is good enough, they're not gonna dry too quickly. But on a wet palette, they do very badly, which is one of the reasons why I never use them really, because I use wet palettes and they tend to separate, and then it becomes annoying to remix the paint with itself, especially if you have done any previous mixing. Like if you have the pure paint, you can just add more. But if you have made a mix, then it's a problem. If you add a glaze ready and it separates, then it's a problem. So they require a lot of maintenance on the palette to work properly, and it's something that a lazy person like me just can't do too well. And then we have Chimera. So let's go for that. Chimera paints are, vibrancy-wise, probably the best paints around when it comes to mini painting paints. These paints are incredible when it comes to vibrancy. They are matte paints, but you can see, like, even dragging the paint out from the puddle. Look how vibrant this magenta is. It's so strong, super strong vibrancy. They are terrible for glazing. I'm just gonna say that out loud. They are terrible paints for glazing because of how powerful the pigmentation is. It's also a very, not really chalky, because they are never chalky, but it is, again, it has a bit of granules to it. So it's very difficult to glaze with these paints. It's not impossible, but it is difficult. I don't suggest them. What they are amazing at is wet blending. You can literally wet blend these paints in moments. It's so easy to wet blend with Chimera paints. I highly suggest them if you're looking for wet blending. Another downside is that the current range of paints they have for sale has very limited colors. I think it's 13 in total, which means unless you really like mixing, like I do, you don't have too much use for these paints. Because, for example, this magenta is way too saturated for any paint job, really. So you want to desaturate it, and you have to understand how to desaturate a color. So you have to work on that. You can't have a dark magenta in a pot like you would from GW. In this case, you have to work with it and modify the colors. But as you can, they are so beautiful. They are pure pigment, which means that most of the range of paints you will find around have more than one pigment inside of the pot, which makes it desaturate pretty much, because the more pigments you add to something, the more it desaturates, because there is mixing happening, and the mixing desaturates the vibrancy. Chimera doesn't do that. They are pure color, just one pigment, and that's what makes them incredible. They are very powerful paints. Their purple almost looks like black. I'll show you. And another cool thing about Chimera, which allows me to explain a very interesting thing about painting in general, is that paints are never on a model how they look on the palette. So I drop purple and it looks black. If I drag it out, it still looks black, right? If I thin it a bit more, there you go. Now we're getting the purple out, see? And it's a beautiful purple. What does that mean? That based on the brand you're using, some paints have a sweet spot where the paint actually reveals itself. In the case of Chimera, you kind of have to thin them a little bit before you actually get the color they are. If you just use them, you know, if you get them out of the pot and you just go like this on a model, you're gonna get a very black purple on the model, which is fine sometimes, but look at the difference. Like, we have this purple here, which is purple, and this is black. So keep in mind that across all brand of paints, there is a sweet spot to make so that the paint actually looks like it does, like it should. Some paints, if you over thin, they become gray, like Vallejo model color. Some paints, if you don't thin enough, they become super chalky, like Scale 75. Some paints, if you don't thin enough, they look black, like Chimera. If you use like in its pureness any color and you just slap it on the model, it's gonna look very dark and very black, except the yellows, of course, but you know that. So always try to understand how to thin every brand, and the best way to do it is by using a white piece of paper. You just get a drop of paint on the piece of paper, and then with some water you start kind of dragging it out away from the main pot, and you see how the paint behaves and looks. And when it dries, you can see like this is a layer, the one on up here, because as you can see it's kind of revealing a lot of the white beneath it. So this would be a real layer consistency, while this is a base coat consistency because it's pretty much covering entirely. So you know, try to understand how much you gotta thin every paint and how much you gotta have on the brush in order to achieve it, because you can have a very thin purple but have a lot of it on the brush and it's gonna look like more of a dark purple. If you just have less on the brush, you're gonna get a more tame looking purple. But it is the same consistency. I have not thinned it more, I just have less on the brush. So it's always a combo between thinning and amount. Keep that in mind when you're painting. I think we are done. The last range I want to talk about is inks. The ones that I use are Liquitex inks. You don't have to buy Liquitex, although I highly suggest it. They are fantastic inks. They work really well in mini painting, and they have pretty much only upsides. No, they don't, but inks, the downside of inks is that if you don't manage them properly, they're gonna ruin a paint job, pretty much, because they're gonna look like a very terrible wash. Another bad thing about inks is that if not controlled enough, and if you have too much quantity of ink in a certain area, it's gonna dry super glossy. So you always want to work with inks with almost none of them on the brush, because if you apply too much, it's gonna dry glossy. But the positives are that inks are pretty much water. As you can see, I have not thinned the paint, I just have less on the brush. If I drag a lot of paint, it's looking black. If I have almost none, it reveals its real color. And the look at the glazing. These paints are incredible for glazing. So if you want to do glazing, use inks. Another amazing thing inks are used for is for being added to other colors. So let's say I have this brown from scale, and I want to thin it. But if I thin it with water, it's gonna have no coverage. So how do I thin it? Well, I can thin it with an ink, because ink is pretty much water. So I can reduce the streakiness of this paint. This is a very exaggerated example because, as I said, artist scale paints do not cover, period, and they also have a lot of streaking happening if you try to base coat with them. But as an example, as you can see, the paint has maintained its color pretty much. I just slightly changed it with the ink, and it allowed me to have a more workable paint. As you can see now I can do some pretty decent layering with this consistency and this dilution, right? Inks are incredible for that. They're just godlike at being used to thin other paints. So if you do have inks, rather than just using them through an airbrush or just using them to glaze, which is fine, try adding them to your colors to push the vibrancy of that color and thinning it. Really, you can just avoid using water altogether and just use inks to thin. And they are insane. And as I said, their glazing is just fantastic. They glaze so well, so well. And you can mix inks between each other too. It's not like you can't. So you can create all the colors you want, and they are fantastic. I love using inks. They are so good. Not enough painters use them or talk about using them on YouTube and Patreon. I hope this particular example can help you understand the power of inks. Doesn't matter how much you thin them, doesn't matter how little you have, they will always have a lot of vibrancy in them, which makes inks look amazing as shadow colors because they help push the volumes a lot more. You can keep the color very dark as a shadow, but it has vibrancy to it, it has power to it, and that makes the model look more interesting. They are great paints, fantastic. Highly suggest getting into using inks rather than GW washes or rather than contrast paints, because contrast paints are literally inks, just thicker. And the problem with contrast paints is that you can't really use them the same way inks would. You can't add a contrast paint to a base color, for example, and have like a more vibrant base color to base coat with. You just can't do that. Inks you can. So if you have to spend money, buy inks rather than contrast. Also, a pot of ink is gonna cost you around 4-5 euros, and it's a lot of material, 30 mil. 15 mil of contrast paint is gonna cost you 6 euros. You get like half for more money, and it's just not as good. So get into inks if you can, because they are great. If you follow the Patreon on the higher tiers, or if you watch the PDFs, you will find out that they use inks all the time to modify colors, to add a bit of nuances to them. It's really something worth looking into. I think I have discussed all the colors and the brands I wanted to talk about, at least the ones I own. I think that what we can, understand from all of this is that there are 3 things that are very important. The first one, colors are never really the way they look on the palette when you apply them on the model. The reason is because the model has its own color beneath it, so try to understand that. It's important to have a bit of a understanding of mixing. What happens if I glaze a purple on top of a blue skin tone or something? Like, the purple is not gonna look like this. It's gonna look differently because the blue beneath it is gonna shine through and modify it. So try to understand that, and this applies to all paints. Also, all paints, more or less, when thinned or when with different quantity on the brush, have different results. Chimera is the strongest, and Chimera and inks are the strongest in that department. The paint can really change a lot based on how much you have on the brush and how much you thin it. It just goes from black to purple it's incredible. It's really incredible to experiment with these paints. I highly suggest Chimera paints, mostly because they teach you so much. I feel like I've learned a lot about painting and colors just using Chimera rather than other brands. So check them out if you can. And inks are fantastic. You should definitely consider buying them. Not a massive range, but a few colors just to push the vibrancy of other colors. And that's what all it means at the very end. Like, what I mean at the end is that all brands are viable as long as you don't get stuck on one of them. If you become a Scale 75 fanboy, for example, get ready to never finish a model in less than a month, because base coating the model only with scale is gonna take forever. So you might wanna, differentiate your collection based on what you need. You can have a brand dedicated to base coating, a brand dedicated to layering, a brand dedicated to glazing, and then you can mix and match between them, like add one color to the other brand to create that in-between color that you might need in that specific paint job. Keep in mind also that different brands have different finishes. Some are very matte, some are very glossy. So if you're working with very different brands, like if you're using Scale 75 and Game Color, the model is going to look a bit weird because some parts of it are going to be looking very glossy, others are going to be looking very matte. So you might want to invest into mediums that change the property of these paints to make the Game Color paints more matte, for example, or varnish the model at the very end so that you can uniform the finish. And yeah, I think this could be a good video. If you have any questions, you can just type them in the comment. I will answer them. I feel like I have said everything I wanted to say about all the different brands and how I feel about them and what makes them good or not. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be more than happy to answer them. Alright? Thank you so much for watching this guide. It's a bonus guide. It's not part of the usual Patreon schedule, but I really wanted to do it, so I just did it. Why not? So yes, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next guides. So take care of yourselves. Bye bye.